Well, this is Shah coming back on my channel to talk about the book Chivalry Chapter 2, which very good stuff in Chapter 2. Very good about how chivalry has shaped our entire culture, even from the laws to the personal interactions, all these kinds of things. Hey, if you're liking this content, give me a like, subscribe, give me a comment below. I love the comments. Let's get to it. All right. Well, so in our book Chivalry, we are in chapter 2. A bastardized chivalry is the title of it. So he goes into in the first part of the chapter again, just like I think we talked about in chapter 1, that chivalry started as something that was taking care of a weaker person. Um, and let me look. Oh, yeah. It's a deference to weakness, is kind of what chivalry started as, whether that was care and protection of children, frail elders, disabled, or someone wounded in battle. I think that was the way I understood it. Was originally it was like you showed deference to a weakness in battle. Like you wouldn't
Yeah,
attack somebody if they were like fell off the horse on the ground, and um, it was unchivalrous to like put your spear right in them when they couldn't defend themselves. Like you'd say, okay, remount or whatever, and then we'll give you a fair chance in battle to compete or whatever.
yeah.
Uh,
Sorry to interrupt. If you want to finish.
no, go
Well, I
ahead.
was just gonna say this goes into this idea of romantic chivalry coming from or being rooted in the more militaristic type chivalry, which it originally was. And in
Yeah.
in this chapter, they talk about how the sort of emergence and divergence of two chivalries happened. But there's a quote from Ernest
Mm.
Beltford Bax that I'll just read for the audience, and it says, "The term meant originally the virtues associated with knighthood considered as a whole, bravery even to the extent of reckless daring, loyalty to the chief or feudal superior, generosity to a fallen foe, general open-handedness and open-heartedness, including, of course, the succor of the weak and the oppressed generally, inter alia, the female sex when in difficulties. Only a fragment of the original connotation of the word chivalry is covered by the term as used in our time, and that even that fragment is torn from its original connection and is made to serve as a scarecrow in the field of public opinion, to intimidate all who refuse to act upon or who protest against the privileges and immunities of the female sex." And that's from 1913. So that
Mm.
that is his description or what he's seeing as the differences
Okay.
there. And that part is interesting to me because even I, as a guy, just hearing chivalry around, I think every instance I've ever heard of chivalry is something that's kind of gynocentric or in reference to
Yeah.
women.
Yeah, it's directed towards women. Even, and that's what he calls out in the first page. Is it is even the Cambridge Dictionary defines it as very polite, honest, and kind behavior, especially towards women.
Yeah.
So that it's like, and so I think that's what he was saying. There's a shift of it used to be deference to weakness of weakness anywhere, and maybe especially on the battlefield, but
Hmm.
anywhere. But then it was deference to the weaker sex is what it shifted to, and then got put into all the romanticism in that married up as well in there. Um, yeah,
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, it's interesting because you think about that. That part surprised me too. The Cambridge definition. I've never looked it up at least, and it kind of calls
mm,
back to, I think what he mentioned a little bit in the first chapter. This kind of feudalization of love, and this militaristic version has everything to do with the knight, pledging fealty to a lord, and
yeah,
representing him and fighting for him. But in this
yes,
case, it gets completely co-opted, almost one for one, or kind of mirrored onto the realm of love and I guess you can say intersexual relations between men and women, and then they start to take on love service, I guess, courtly love service to different ladies of the court and perform
Well, no,
tasks
and
for
that's
them.
that's interesting. You bring that up about swearing to the Lord, because he says in 1102, romantic chivalry was first introduced by William the Ninth, who um, instead of fighting war strictly on behalf of a king, William is said to have the image of his mistress painted on his shield, whom he called maidens or his lord, saying that he was doing her will, or sorry, saying it was his will to bear her in battle as she has borne him in bed.
Yeah.
So we see the shift of like, I'm I'm serving my lord and my country to no, now I'm serving my lady as I go off to battle here.
Yeah, that, reading that part too, I thought was interesting because I do agree with this idea. Like, if the US was ever attacked, like somebody tried to take over a piece of land, I don't think most guys would be thinking, "Oh my God, my woman, I have to go battle for that." It would just be such an offense that somebody tried to attack the
Mm,
homeland, so to speak, and
yeah.
there'd be this, "No, no, I don't think so, not here." And it's more
Mm,
about, I think the motivations are way different than, I guess, carrying a banner for some woman. It's more about, no, this is our land and you need to get off of it. And it's for country and
yeah.
stuff like that. And I would even think, I don't know. Like, when I think about most folks, I guess, going into battle or becoming soldiers, I'd like to think it has more to do with that, with family and country, I guess you can say, and the pride of that
I
kind of
guess
stuff than
yeah,
the woman.
it probably does, but then you still, I think you mentioned in chapter one, you still see the idea in movies and maybe books and stuff where this guy's on the battlefield and he has a picture of his girlfriend or his wife that he's fighting for, and oh, when I get home, then we're gonna get married or whatever, and
Yeah, in the media.
um, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I know what you mean, and I, I wonder how much of that is media versus like what actually is kind of going on, But
Well, there is the in the Marines, there's the term Jody, and Jody is the guy who's stealing your girl while you're off at war.
Jody got your girl. Yeah, I've heard that before.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe it's a thing. I don't know. I haven't been in the military.
Yeah.
But yeah.
One thing that I found interesting too was when I was looking at this timeline. So, Peter Wright provides a timeline in here of kind of events that
Mm,
led to the emergence of romantic chivalry and how it kind of takes over. And I
yeah.
was surprised that Duke of Aquitaine was mentioned first because I've always heard about Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine and kind of her role in this, but I didn't realize that
Yes.
her father actually kind of kicked this off. So now I really understand probably why she maybe believed the things that she did or what inspired her. Maybe she just really got that from her father and just took it to the next
Oh.
level.
Yeah, I didn't even pick up on that. I was looking at how Eleanor and Marie established the courts of love. So that's where we get this courtly love. So they
Yeah.
established these courts that would judge whether or not a knight had acted uh, in a well, I guess it would be, oh yeah, a chivalrous way. Yeah. According to their rules for love, which was a adulterous love though too, is a good thing
Yeah.
to know. This is plain adultery that they were engaging in here because all these women were married to nobles and then they're engaging in adultery with these knights.
That part was
Uh,
really surprising to me because it's like, how are they getting away with this? But I guess they're just so maybe rich and powerful that they're able to. It's the only thing I
yeah.
could think of because you think this has got to be outright bad. And it's interesting that, I mean, as soon as they start doing this, you got to start having courts. So Eleanor and Maria, I think, as you mentioned, established courts of love where
Yeah.
people would have disputes over love and they would cast. It almost sounds like it sounds kind of out there, but it's kind of surreal to think that that was really happening or that it really existed, a court of love, and it
Yeah, and
functioned
I
in the
don't know
same
if I
way.
really understood if the knight had to actually show up to that court or if they just like did this and then he was like the next time he came into town, he was just on the outs because you've been declared unchivalrous, so nobody's talking to you in high society anymore.
Yeah, well, that's an important point there too because I mean, these are a lot of kind of powerful people that are, I guess, deciding to do this. So, a kind of there's this other layer, I guess, of subtlety when it comes to playing this game, and it could probably
Yeah.
have you fall out of the favor of court or whatever it is, or if some real powerful person is in love with someone else and that person has it out for you, they can use whoever it is that uh is
Mm,
in love with them maybe to take it out on you, and then however it is, there must be all this other layer of games. What's interesting too is that
mm,
Marie, as Chrétien de Troyes, to write Lancelot. And it's interesting because we've all probably,
Yeah.
heard of Lancelot, and it's like, oh, that's a romantic chivalric story. And there's even
Yes.
a thing in here that says that he objected to the implicit approval of the adulterous affair between Lancelot and Guinevere that Marie had
Mm,
directed him to write about and failed to finish it. So they had later poets come in and finish that story because the original
yeah, that
writer
was
himself
interesting.
was like, I can't write this. This is bad. They're having an adulterous affair. I don't want my name on this book.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. And that, but that's it's interesting too. Like if you watch like what was it First Night with Richard Gere, where he plays Lancelot, and there's an
Mhm.
affair in that movie,
Yeah.
and you watch it like, oh, this is bad. But it's like, no, that's what the original story was an
Yeah.
adult affair. And then there's another one. Was it Tristan and Isolde
Oh
or
yeah, I remember that Tristan and Isolde. I can't remember how to say it.
Yeah, however you
Yeah.
say her name, it was the exact same thing. They had an affair. Like, and but that's how chivalry works. It's adultery through and through there.
What's interesting about that is there's this kind of adulterous stuff going on. And it's funny that Eleanor of Aquitaine is such a big figure here because she has an interesting dowry. I'll have to double check this, but I think it was her who was married to King Louis the Seventh or so at first. And well,
Okay.
it is her because her name's Eleanor of Aquitaine because this is a province in France that's pretty large and it's a pretty profitable province. So that was her
Oh,
dowry, basically.
oh,
So she's married to King Louis the Seventh, and for whatever reason, they had two daughters, I think, and their marriage got annulled. So Aquitaine went back with
whoa.
Eleanor of Aquitaine, and then she got married to the King of England. I can't remember which one it was, but this created a huge problem for France because now Aquitaine, which is her dowry, was effectively under the control of England, which is a part of France proper. And this, I think, eventually that led into warring between them. But it's funny because it's like she's the one who really brings romantic love and this adulterous, I guess, lifestyle to make it popular amongst, the noble folks here of Europe. And at the same time, it's like her actual marriages are still done with dowries and stuff like that. So it's like, I think it probably is all firmly rooted in adultery because most people are still practicing marriage formally or the way it's supposed
Yeah,
to be done, and they're having these affairs on the side.
yeah, yeah.
As a child support officer, it kind of makes me wonder about paternity and other things like that. But there were no genetic tests back then, so.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah.
uh,
Is this really an heir of the king or
yeah, how do we know?
like yeah, only God would know that stuff now.
Yeah.
Back in Yeah. But yeah, that's a good transition then of so this started with the nobles and the high society as this like game that they played, an
Hmm.
adulterous game that I guess was fun for them somehow. But then he talks about how even the lower classes started to adopt some assumptions portrayed in the public displays, such as the importance of chivalrous behavior towards women,
Hmm.
and perhaps a belief in women's purity and moral superiority. So there's this shift that starts happening with everybody believing that women are more pure and morally superior based on this chivalry, this romantic chivalry that women are the rewarders and the knights approach them to get their reward. And he says certainly by the 1600s and beyond, the adaptation of romantic chivalry by lower classes was in full career, as evidenced by something he names off here. So, and that was the quote. So this was a quote from Venetian Society in the year 1600, which was kind of blew me away when he says it was or this writer
Lucrezia.
Lucrezia.
Yeah, so it's a
Yeah,
woman writer, so it's a quote from her.
yeah. He said it's a marvelous sight in our city to see a wife of a shoemaker or butcher or even a porter all dressed up with gold chains around her neck, with pearls and valuable rings on her fingers, accompanied by a pair of women on either side to assist her and give her a hand. And then, by contrast, to see this is like the TradCon trope here to
Yeah.
see her husband cutting up meat all soiled with ox's blood, all and down at heel or loaded up like a beast of burden, dressed in rough clothes as porters are. So his wife gets to live the life of leisure, and he gets to just slogging away day after day
He's
to keep
expected
her.
to work doubly hard so that she can have the finery and all these gold rings and all these fine linens and stuff. And it is
Wow.
interesting that you mentioned this kind of relation because that is kind of what tradcons, that's their rhetoric sounds strangely like this. It's always like, well, you need to take two jobs and she shouldn't have to worry about this at all, and the men aren't
Yeah.
doing
No,
good,
I
you know.
I was just talking to a friend of mine about that. That we both really like this pastor who's very, very traditional guy, and I think he has like 7 kids. And
Mhm.
he told his wife, he said, "I don't care if I have to work 3 jobs. I will keep you at home so you can be with our kids, and I will go out and do it." I'm just like, huh, why would you have to work 3 jobs just
Yeah.
so she can stay at home and live the life of leisure baking sourdough bread?
The
Like, where did we get? And I'm beginning, as we're reading this book, like I'm beginning to see like, oh well, yeah, this is where it came from.
Yeah, and most of it is the excess expenditure on luxury items that she probably wouldn't need, I guess, to put it
Yeah.
bluntly. You know what's interesting too? You mentioned the kind of evolution or timeline, so to speak, of this stuff spreading into the culture, and it's interesting because I was looking at the timeline, and as these things are being written in the 1100s here, that's before like the printing press. So, only
Mhm.
folks who are well to do would probably be able to afford books because they're more expensive to be made back then.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah.
they were more likely to be literate. So they're reading these stories, but at the same time, troubadours and people are probably making announcements and people tell stories so people can listen to them, who
Mm.
maybe can't read. So that's starting to change the culture. But then the quote we just read, that's from 1600. So by 1600, you
Yeah,
have the printing press and you
yeah.
start to have more of these kind of romantic chivalric novels being made, being printed, and they're starting to spread like wildfire. So that's having a huge impact. Not to mention
Mm.
troubadours doing their thing basically, and spreading this around. So some people might not be
Yeah.
able to afford it, but literacy rates going up, times are changing, and whatever the nobles do or people in this high class, it kind of is cool, so to speak, and people want to emulate that if they can. And that's how you get this guy who's basically a beast of burden, and he's got really rough cloth on, and he still has blood on from cutting up all the meat and probably working overtime to get his wife
Yeah.
gold chains around her neck and valuable rings on her fingers.
Yeah, and she just gets to walk around with her friends and live the life of leisure. Or, I mean, for the tradcons today, it would be like, yeah, she gets to stay at home with her children and,
Be a trad
not do,
wife,
yeah, not
and
do a lot of anything there. Because I had somebody like, oh no, they're working so hard in the homes, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I don't know. I think the average wife that's just staying at home, I don't really know if she's working that hard. I mean, we have washing machines, we we have air fryers, we have like I guess if you're making sourdough bread every single day
but
and
it's like who's doing that? And for some reason, every time I see one of those posts or TikToks, it's always like cinnamon rolls or some kind of dessert. It's like I want to see you making a beef bone broth from scratch and then using that to make another
yeah,
meal. Like make some
yeah.
kind of food. It reminds me. I actually saw a tweet today, and this is from a guy called slumRNA_dog. And he says, I've been a stay at home dad for 48 hours while my wife has been on a work trip. And I gotta say, I really don't see what's so hard about this. The dishes are done, the kids are fed, they make it to school. I'm lifting weights in the garage and playing with the 3-year-old. Like, I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop and me to realize I wasn't doing something extremely important and laborious the whole time, and it's not happening. I turn on the TV and put
Mm.
away laundry. I turn off the TV and go bike riding with the kids. What's the catch? So he's just like, I've been doing, pretty much what the wife, I guess, has been doing for a while, and he's just like, I don't see what everybody's complaining about. This isn't
Well,
terrible.
yeah, that's exactly right. That I think the modern man has figured this out because I was telling the mountain how this lady I really love that comes on my show sometimes talk about like patriarchy and just like traditional family value, traditional Christian family values and whatnot. And so I was telling her, I was like, yeah, I think the modern woman kind of gave up the game by having the man do a lot of the chore, just like this guy is saying, doing these things in the home. And then he's looking at his wife like, what is taking you so long?
Yeah,
Like,
what's
what are
the
you
issue?
doing? Because it used to be they would keep that a mystery of like, oh,
Yeah.
I bet you go and work and it's just so much work at home. You don't even understand, but I
Yeah.
don't want you to understand either. But now it's like they gave up the game. It's like, no, we do understand. It's not that hard. Like, what are you
Yeah.
doing?
Well,
There's
yeah.
comics that make jokes about that,
it-
you know?
and women can be great at like really telling a long story that almost like puts you to sleep. So you're like, it sounds like a lot of stuff probably happened when maybe less things did. You know, it's interesting
Mm,
also, you did mention this discussion about romantic chivalry kind of putting women in this place of being looked at as pure and kind of, I guess, representative of morality or basically setting the
yeah,
moral standard, so to speak. And it's interesting because it
yeah.
makes me think of Red Pill. And it's like Red Pill, at least that side of the internet, is what really, I guess, kind of exposed to some extent or popped the bubble for a lot of blue pilled guys that no, women aren't these pure angelic creatures that we all take
Hmm.
them for because of the romantic chivalric gaslighting. They're actually
Yeah.
maybe just as rough as guys can be in terms of some of the stuff that they do without us knowing about and things like that. So it's just interesting. I mean, they're just as human as men are. The fact is, but the way this kind of changes the culture is it adds to this feudalization and this kind of pedestalization by making people believe that. And then with that comes the next section that he talks about shame basically and how the education of men back then, a lot of it was done through the use of shame to get them to be more chivalrous, basically, and put their manhood at stake.
Oh,
There
yeah.
was a good quote
Yeah.
in here that I'd like to read, and it says, "To illustrate such education, we are provided an anecdote of a young boy named Jean de Santre,
Mm.
page of honor at the court of the French king. A dame de belle cousine inquired of the boy the name of the mistress of his heart's affection." So back then in the court, they would be expected to name somebody that had their heart's affections as they were younger. And it could be someone older, I guess. And this is how they would start to learn chivalry and how to go about this kind of stuff. And the
Oh.
quote says, "The simple youth replied that he loved his lady mother, and next to her, his sister Jacqueline was dear to him. 'Young man,'
Mm.
rejoined the lady, 'I am not speaking of the affection due to your mother and sister, but I wish to know the name of the lady to whom you are attached par amour.' The poor boy was still more confused, and he could only reply that he loved no one par amour. The Dame de Belle Cousine charged him with being a traitor to the laws of chivalry, and declared that his craven spirit was evinced by such an avowal. Whence, she inquired, sprang the valiancy and knightly feats of Lancelot, Gawain, Tristram, Giron the courteous, and other ornaments of the Round Table of Pontus, and of those knights and squires of this country, whom I could enumerate. Whence the grandeur of many whom I have known to rise to renown, except from the noble desire of maintaining themselves in the grace and esteem of the ladies." So it's
Mm.
just kind of showing. So this guy is kind of put on the spot, and it's like, so who is it that your heart longs for? And he's like, there's nobody. I mean, I love my family. And they're like, how
Yeah.
dare you? You're a coward for not saying who it is that you love and all the real knights. And she's naming knights from stories, which is kind of funny. Um,
Yeah.
all of them, accomplished these great feats of, I guess you could say, chivalry only because of the women that they maintained in their hearts and gave deference to and all this kind of stuff. So or went into love
Mhm.
service for. So that's
Yeah.
kind of the beginning of at least the shaming language in the sense of uh you know romantic chivalry taking over and creating this pedestalization of the woman. So the shame part is very important and is still with us even
Mm.
today.
Yeah, even says a Google search for unchivalrous co-occurs with the word shame like 54,000 times.
Yeah, that
Which
was
is
really
like,
interesting.
wow. Yeah. So if you, or even, there's one thing I underlined was the idea of being a gentleman is almost entire. Like when somebody says gentleman, you almost assuredly think he is a chivalrous man who defers to women. Like
Yeah,
he handles women with care if he's a gentleman. Like I don't know what else that term really entails today
y-
other than
you're right. It's kind of
deference to
like
women.
It's kind of like the word, like I was mentioning me just as a guy, every time I've ever heard chivalry, it tends to be something in respect to women, and gentleman's
Yeah.
kind of the same thing. It's always like opening doors for a lady, or putting your jacket over the puddle, or walking on the side of the road that's closer to the cars, or whatever it happens to
Mm.
be. It's always something that has more to do with women. I feel like gentleman might be a term that we need to redefine, or at least take it back to maybe what it used to
Well,
mean or
yeah,
something.
I think I do, especially for me, because as a Christian man, gentleness is a fruit of the spirit that we're called to as Christian men. And so if that gets hijacked, gentleness into, well, a gentleman, well, you defer to women, which is basically what the church does. The church teaches that a real Christian man defers to women and serves women and does all this kind of stuff, right? So yeah, I agree. That needs to be taken back to mean something else than just
Yeah.
deference.
And it's not, it's funny because it's like we're using the word gentleman, but there's this overall concept of masculinity that's the same treatment has been given to, and but
Yeah.
it's funny, actually, you mentioned the church, and I a couple streams ago on my channel, I did a stream about essentially marriages in 19th century Germany, and how pairings
Hmm.
were made. And romantic chivalry and these kind of overtures of love are everywhere, but they're looking at the actual data, and they're looking at who's getting married and what assets they brought in. And people, especially from the lower classes, still have these very practical decisions to be made. So even though they might, make a declaration of love, they're still matching based off of what assets both parties are bringing in. And it's
Oh,
interesting because in that story, or not story, excuse
right.
me,
Good logical Germans too. Very logical
very
people.
pragmatic, very
Yes.
pragmatic people. But I'm sorry, in that paper, it was
Yes.
an academic paper in the Journal of Family History. There's a mention in there about how even like all this stuff about romantic love and stuff is being preached in the schools. It's being preached at the pulpit. So people are growing up with this kind of being inundated everywhere, and they're trying
Mm,
to get to the bottom of how are the pairings being made. So I can understand what you're saying. It's something that really did take over not just stories of romantic chivalry, but it made its way into schools. It's made its way into churches.
yeah.
And
No, really. I mean, it's sad that we can't. For me, and we may have talked about this before, but in Scripture, when it talks about marriage and the love between a man and a woman, it's not talking about romantic love at all.
oh yeah,
That
yeah,
was like that was out of the minds of the authors that we believe were inspired by God to write these things. But when we read it today, we cannot read it without thinking, yes, he's talking about romantic love. It's romantic love
well,
here, and
it's even more ironic when you look at it and you think, okay, romantic love essentially is rooted in adulterous, I guess, affairs between people, and
yeah,
has nothing to do with marriage, how it was traditionally, done. So yeah, I mean, I think the folks who were writing that definitely probably were not thinking of adulterous style
yeah.
of
Well, that's
engagements.
that's what C.S. Lewis calls out, even in this chapter. C.S. Lewis is quoted because he was an Anglican theologian. He calls that out a lot about how like we're going back to the roots of chivalry, which is adultery.
Yeah,
And he says you either have biblical marriage or you have chivalry and romantic courtly love, but you can't have both. Like you
yeah.
got to pick because they're antithetical to each other. And C.S. Lewis talks about that a lot in his books. Um, I just wish we heard more about that in the church.
I hear.
Yeah.
Well, I can understand that. I mean, from folks that I've talked to. You're not the only one who's told me that before. So I've heard that from
Well,
multiple
Paul Elam,
different
I'm
people.
sure, is, big with that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. It's also interesting too because it makes me think of family law. And there's somebody on my channel. His name's Klaus, and he just talked about how family law had changed. Because we're looking at the dowry, and we're looking at what the love match taking over. And
Mm,
it's like this kind of adulterous stuff. People kind of want their cake and eat it too with this. So they're like, okay, well, we want this, and we want this to be incorporated with marriage somehow. So they move away from a dowry system. It becomes about the love match. And then
yeah.
I think that's where you start to see laws that are more about like at fault divorce, and basically things that are here to figure out what's going to happen once the love goes away and this marriage becomes really bitter. Then it's about who injured who, and this kind of thing. And then the bottom really falls out once we get no fault divorce, because now you're doing love matches and it's
Yeah.
no fault divorce. So as soon as the love dries up, and a lot of people report that, especially with love matches, there's a quote from a French guy, ironically, where we get the city of love, Paris, and he's basically saying that, like, yeah, if you marry for love, this is in that paper on 19th century Germany, anybody who marries for love can expect to pretty much hate each other after, the first few years into a marriage. So you
Whoa.
start to see this kind of, it's just funny to me because even the people back then who were watching this changeover had already seen these big issues coming about.
Yeah. Yeah. Man. Well, um, let me see. So as we go on, just to kind of finish out the
Sure.
chapter here, um, he talks about well, you were talking about shame, and then even in little kids' books now, he brings up how you can see the knight defending milady, blah blah. So we teach that from an early age, even
Yeah,
to
the damsel in distress.
that. Yeah, the boy must defend the damsel in distress. Um, yeah, and
Well, in this whole, I guess this idea of damseling, which is interesting because I've heard red pillars use this as a term, and it's kind
mm,
of a signaling from the woman to kind of get to activate the blue pillar, so to speak, to come to her rescue, and it is a it is something that's pervasive in a lot of different facets, not even just in the romantic realm, but also he brings up the difference between sentencing and court, and
oh
how
yeah.
for the same crime women typically get, I guess, less harsh sentences. um
Hmm.
and it was, that part was really interesting to me. It was pretty well sourced in here. I'm hoping to find where he wrote that, but that's another form of this kind of, women are pure arbiters of
Yeah.
morality, and oh, they couldn't possibly be, they must be a victim of somebody who made them do this, or they, it's.
Was that in the section about benevolent sexism?
Yes. Yes, that was in benevolent sexism. That's right. Let's see if I can pull that
Yeah,
up.
because he was saying benevolent sexism facilitates the capacity to gain material resources and complements feelings of deservingness by promoting a structure of intimate relationships in which men use their access to social power and status to provide for women. And then I think the flip side of that is like you were saying, even when it's time to punish people,
Yeah.
women get far less punishment for the same crimes.
Yeah, or if you see like a woman do bless you, if you see a woman do a certain crime to a man, there would be a lighter sentence, but if a man does the same thing to a woman, it would be much harsher. So there's this kind of
Mm,
reverence. Uh
yeah.
and it echoes this kind of feudalization that is sort of at the core of this entire, romantic chivalric um phenomenon here, basically.
Yeah. Well, and then he talks about societal chivalry being some examples he gives was like in Australia, they had this campaign, stand up, speak out, and act to ensure the dignity, safety, and comfort of any women,
Oh yeah.
even strangers who might find themselves in real or imagined dangers. So, men, it is on you to protect all women everywhere in our society. You need to stand up. And I think we have the same thing in the US, though, right? I forgot.
And if you don't, you'll be stand with her, I think. Or, well, I'll tell you this. I mean,
Something like that,
it
right?
goes back into the shame angle too, because if you don't do that, or if you're a guy who looks out for your own interests, they're going to question your masculinity or manhood, or say, that you're a bad guy. The thing that I found
Yeah.
particularly surprising was the how both feminists and non-feminist women both like benevolent sexism. He wrote a 2018 survey of
Yeah.
782 female subjects found women believe male partners displaying benevolent sexist attitudes are more willing to protect, provide for, and commit to them, which in turn rendered those men more attractive. Interestingly, feminist women were just as likely as non feminist women to prefer benevolently sexist men over more egalitarian men, regardless of whether they rated themselves as high or low feminists. High feminists
Mm.
rated the benevolent sexist men as more patronizing and undermining than did low feminists, but felt the positive sides of benevolent sexism outweighed the negative. So they're still enjoying kind of having their cake and eating it too, even while
Yeah.
being a staunch feminist. I found that
Yeah.
pretty surprising.
Yeah. I were you really surprised about
I,
that?
I, I
Like, I
guess
mean, I'm
not
not.
surprised. It's just surprising in the sense of feminists will say, well, we want,
They talk out of both sides of their mouth.
egalitarianism. Yeah, but then on the other end, it's like, well, no, men should still be doing this for me. And I also thought
Yeah.
this part right here was just outright like, where it says, which in turn rendered those men more attractive. And I can imagine women putting that out on a survey, but it's like red pillars were kind of the ones to find out that the guys who do that and sort of bend over backwards actually aren't being selected by women for as far
Whoa,
as you know
that's a good point. I didn't even
yeah
pick up on that. Yeah, that they would say that's attractive, but
yeah
it's
I
not
guess it's
like,
expected, like you say. Maybe it's not that surprising, but it's just funny that they would kind of outright say that. Even women who
yeah,
consider themselves feminists are still consciously kind of saying like, no, we would still prefer the benevolent sexism. And it's funny because I feel like it always
yeah.
roots in this kind of like, well, we were treated unfairly from just 100 years ago to the beginning of time, therefore it's justified or something like that. It always seems to fall on something like that.
Yeah, it does. Well, but even in that same line of thinking, then when he was talking about societal chivalry, he said, now, and you've brought this up too,
Mm.
where he says chivalry operates outside the interpersonal sphere in which men have traditionally given up their seats in buses.
Hmm.
But now governments are providing seats for women in legislative assemblies, boardrooms via quotas. So,
That
and
was a
you
good
brought this
point.
up where like men have to compete for jobs with women in the marketplace. We're competing for the same
Yeah.
jobs, and they're given preferential treatment in these jobs.
And
And yet
and
the
men are
men are
still
still
expected.
provided,
Yeah,
yeah, to
they're still
provide everything.
expected to provide for women that are taking half the jobs away. And sometimes, as you say, given preference and maybe chosen
No,
over men just because of their gender and not entirely
if
because of merits.
oh, yeah. If you're in a STEM field, if you have two people that are have the same skills, and one's a man and one's a woman, the woman is getting the job. Like she absolutely is getting that job.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. I mean, there's no question in my mind that happens every single day. Well, even companies publish that in their stockholder reports, like how many women they've hired. Like they make it blatantly clear we are hiring women over men. Like it's in our metrics that we're
Yeah.
doing. Like it's not a
Yeah.
secret.
That's right. I think it was you who told me that before, but I think they do that to try to either be compliant or try to get more funding or whatever the deal
Yeah,
is.
I think it's so they don't get defunded by some of these huge hedge funds and stuff like that that want to see preferential treatment given to women.
The other
So,
part of this chapter that I think this kind of relates to nicely is this idea of narcissism. And
mm,
there was this discussion, I guess, of how essentially romantic chivalry, which is still embedded in our society, and this kind of benevolent sexism and how it's encouraged kind of leads to entitlement or maybe something that is kind of akin to a narcissism. Maybe not a true narcissism, but
yeah, I
it
remember
is
him talking
very
about that.
similar to it, which
Yeah.
I found that to be an interesting discussion. And
Mm.
on the other end of that scale, while women might have this overinflated sense of self, men on the other hand have a maybe a deflated sense of self, and they're afraid to reach out, and it has these negative outcomes on men because they're afraid of not being seen as a man. So it just
Yeah.
leads to a kind of double problem here.
Well, kind of like you were saying about, some of the red pill things. I know that's a big one in the red pill space is that you make yourself your own mental point of origin.
I've heard
Whereas
that before. Yeah.
because usually if you're in a relationship, you are the point of origin is with her,
Yeah.
like whatever she wants. But then the red pill is saying, no, you make yourself the mental point of origin. And the funny thing is, if you do that and you do it for long enough, she's actually happier when you are the mental point of origin because she doesn't want to be put on a pedestal. That's unattractive for you to put her on the
Hmm.
pedestal,
Yeah, it
even
doesn't.
though, yeah,
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what a lot of at least from what I remember from like the earlier days of Red Pill, especially, that's the stuff that would break a guy out of the conditioning. And usually it would happen kind of late, maybe once the light switch effect happened and they found out, oh, maybe she didn't really like him the same way that he liked her.
Yeah.
And then they kind of kick themselves when they learn about that, and about how a lot of the stuff that men are kind of raised to do actually diminishes attraction
Yeah.
instead of cultivating it, which is what people should be naturally doing anyways. But they've been
Yeah. No,
co-opted
that's
by
a
this.
it's a great point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's kind of interesting too, because it's like in this feudal model, it's like how could this, if somebody is pedestalized or put in this position of superiority, how could they maybe respect and love the person that is ostensibly beneath them in the same way? It's something that's quite different. I could read a paragraph here
Yeah.
from, and this is in a study called "The Allure of Sexism." Researched whether a sense of entitlement to special treatments, a central facet of narcissism based on feelings of superiority and deservingness, was linked with endorsement of benevolent sexism by women across time. And the quote says, if women endorse benevolent sexism because of the individual level benefits it offers, then women's endorsement of benevolent sexism should vary depending on dispositional differences and psychological entitlement. Psychological entitlement is a core facet of narcissism, which encompasses feelings that the self deserves nice things, social status, and praise, and beliefs of the self as superior, highly intelligent, and attractive. The model of narcissistic self-regulation characterizes psychological entitlement as manifesting in efforts to gain esteem, status, and resources. Such efforts include adopting a superficially charming, confident, and energetic approach to social interactions, taking personal responsibility for successes and attributing failures to external sources, and acting selfishly to secure material gains, even when it means exploiting others. I can see how somebody who's giving preferential treatment, whether if it's for a job or just everything, would eventually maybe see this as normal and fall into that category of just
Oh,
expecting these things and blaming others
yeah.
for failures and having a constant sort of victim mentality instead of taking
Yeah.
ownership of things.
Man, that's a great point. I mean, it's kind of tough just to lump all females into the same category there, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, yeah, you could see how that could, and maybe that's why we're in spot we're in 2025 right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And
That it can lead to that.
I agree with you about that. There's obviously, people that aren't. It's just, I guess, looking if the overall culture is this and does this,
Yeah.
then it's not hard to like. To me, it makes sense to say, well, if this is what it's encouraging, probably a lot more people are starting to fall that way, or something
Yeah.
like
Here's the
that.
outcomes we're going to get. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't think he said it was like a true narcissism or something like that, but it was just like this kind of interesting,
Yeah.
I guess you can say, relation.
Well, and then with that, he talks about kind of wrapping up the chapter. He
Mhm.
talks about the negative outcomes for men and boys because of chivalry
Mhm.
that or no, he's talking negative health outcomes for men
Yeah.
and boys, because chivalry emphasizes protection of women, and thus men are placed in danger of being injured, maimed, or killed when intervening in difficult situations. And then even, some people talk about how you can intervene if a man is like slapping a woman or something, you might intervene,
Mhm.
and then she ends up getting right back with that guy that you were trying to intervene with, and maybe you got stabbed or
Yeah.
something.
I
It's
mean,
like,
we've seen examples of that on the internet. There's literally videos of
yeah,
that happening. Um it's
yeah, and you would put yourself in. I mean, we're taught that we should put ourselves in harm's way to defend my lady, even a
yeah.
stranger you never met, that you know nothing about. You don't know nothing about the situation. That's what's going on.
Mhm.
But if you don't do that, you're not a real man.
Yeah.
Then,
Yeah, and I get it. Like I could understand the pull. Like even if I see something, it is kind of like, oh man, I mean, but at the same time, it's like when it comes to men, there is this over and beyond expectation of sort of sinking with the ship, so to speak, even for people that are essentially strangers to you that you don't
yeah,
know. I mean, and it's kind of interesting because you think about what does a red pill or a MGTOW look at this? People who just walk away and say, "All right, forget it. If I'm not appreciated, then why am I going to put myself in this
yeah.
situation?"
I actually agree that is some of the healthy deprogramming of the gynocentric behavior of like yeah, why would I, like me being a married man who has kids, why would I put myself in harm's way for some stranger that I don't know when like that could be detrimental to my family if I got
Yeah,
killed, I got
exactly.
hurt, like permanently injured or whatever. Like what would that benefit my tribe at all if I
Yeah.
did that?
That
And
I
I think
mean,
like kind of we go back to the ancients a lot. I think the ancients probably would look at that and be like, "Boy, you're an idiot. What are you doing?"
it is perfectly reasonable. I mean, we have obligations to, our kin, and I understand there's other societal obligations and duties to the community and whatever it happens to be, but
Yeah.
somebody who's making bad decisions and putting themselves in a position, and maybe they're willingly in a bad relationship that's really toxic, and then you, some random innocent guy who happens to be walking by, is expected to go get in the middle of this and then get into a
Mm.
knife fight with somebody. It doesn't make sense, especially considering your other more high priority obligations in your life.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just best to call the
Yeah.
police, and let them sort it
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Do your duty and call the police. That's probably.
Yeah.
And, yeah. But he does kind of end there and say, like, this gender preferential bias has been referred to as gynosympathy, a practice that negatively, shoot, where did I go here?
Practice
Uh,
that negatively, or excuse me, I can read. I think I see it's at that last paragraph at the top. This gender
yeah.
preferential bias has been referred to as gynosympathy, a practice
Yeah.
that negatively impacts men's willingness to seek help and assistance when needed. That
Mm,
part, that part right there was really interesting to me. I mean, I think it is true
yeah.
as guys, and
You're
that's
kind of
where,
expected to suffer in silence, or else you're not a real man.
yeah, and
And
that's where there is a hijacking, I think, of masculinity, and men are being controlled by letting others kind of define it for them, or at least really co-opted into something that maybe doesn't make sense in the first place. And that's also why male spaces are, I think, are important, because men can at least talk about this kind of stuff somewhere instead of,
well, they're important and they're dangerous to the gynocentric world
yeah.
order.
That's why they keep
You end
coming
up,
after him.
I think that's true. I know that's a little conspiratorial, but it is true. It's dangerous to the gynocentric world. If you have a bunch of guys that keep getting together sharing notes, I mean that's all the Red Pill was, I guess, back in the day was a bunch of guys that got together and
Just
shared notes.
sharing
But
notes.
hey, this
Yeah.
chivalry stuff doesn't really work for us getting good women that love us, you know?
They started noticing patterns because a lot of people's, I guess you can say, heartbreak stories started seeming a lot more common and similar
Yeah.
than otherwise expected. And they're like, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Yeah,
See,
wait a minute. Like it's like some friends of mine at work. They were complaining about their wives doing something or other, and the one guy's like, "Hey, are we married to the same woman?"
yeah, exactly. That is a common phenomenon in the space. And I mean, because I remember I used to read, some of the stuff, especially I was always very interested in marriages and kind of how those would break down. And you'd hear about this thing called the light switch effect, or just suddenly there was just a different person. And a lot of people would describe kind of the same thing or the same series of events, and them trying to take similar actions to fix it, and oh, well, we tried to make sure she was in a good mood, we did the dishes, put the kids to sleep, did all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff, tried to do
Uh,
date night, but it's just not working. And
mm.
that's kind of where we're at now. So I mean, I think that's an interesting question too, is how pervasive is romantic chivalry? Because part of me wants to say it's changing. The other part of me looks at kind of tradcon stuff or what you see coming out of there, and it's like it might be as strong as ever if I'm
Yeah. Well, and
feeling
I think that's where
pessimistic.
that's funny you say that because he concludes the chapter with the chivalry provides men a life map to guide their social behavior and give them a sense of self-based service to women. Like, this is our purpose in life to
Yeah.
serve women. We provide, protect, and procreate. And it's in service to it's not in service to our family and our tribe and my uh let's see what am I saying here? My kingdom. Like,
Mm-hmm.
well, it's my kingdom, right? It's not in service to that, it's in service to women. Like it's
Yeah.
all in what we're doing for women here. And this is what I call out on my channel all the time, which I think is the worst part, is this is taught by the church and men in the church over and over and over and over again. And it's like, no, when you look at what the Bible actually says, the Bible from cover to cover is patriarchal, through and through. It is not we serve women, but it just gets twisted in that because of chivalry, I believe. Is like
Yeah.
we've just been brainwashed with this stuff.
It is interesting because it's like the sort of it feels like the natural default is about family and having all that stuff there, and your duty and obligation to your kin folks, so to speak. But then it
Mhm.
becomes kind of this is what you're supposed to do for strangers that you don't even know, and these strangers, not to mention you having to do that, but they're also seen as pure and damsels and the arbiter of morality.
Oh,
They set the standard of
yeah,
what's moral and what's not. So
yeah.
if your entire masculinity is based off of what they're saying is good or bad or what you should be doing and shaming you into it, then yeah, it's
Mm,
very much a kind of metaphorical leash put around you. And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
stopping you from probably being able to explore masculinity in a way that would make more sense for you as a person. So
What I like how he wrapped it up as far as like how to get out of this chivalric society, I think he's kind of talking about. And he says, in an age of equality, one might ask what continuing relevance has romantic chivalry. If we follow the definition of chivalry in the Cambridge Dictionary as a very polite, honest, and kind behavior, is it still necessary to add the usual adjunct, especially by men toward women? And so he's saying like we should be equal with chivalry, that we apply it to everybody, not from men to women,
yeah.
but that it goes across the board. And I was like, yeah, that sounds like a good place to start. Like we get rid of this one way um, deference.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's interesting too because I mean, you know, it would make more sense if it was more like the original, where it's like, okay, there's an obligation to the weak or something in the community, which could be anybody. It could be disabled men. He actually brought up disabled, I think, in here, and
mm,
men being sort of forgotten about, but
yeah,
versus more just about women in general. And then it's like we live in a time of this weird kind of, I guess you could say, dissonance where it's like men are, if it's based off of a kind of deference to weakness and a protection of that, and but then at the
mm,
same time women are strong and empowered and independent, but you're still expected to do these things. It's this weird thing where it's like you're just hurting yourself and they're just taking advantage on both sides of an equation in order to just get
yeah.
more and more and more and
Now,
more.
luckily, I believe the Gen Zers are waking up to this. So,
I think so
uh,
also. I do like
yeah.
the last
I don't
sentence
know
that
how, but I think they're waking up to it somehow. I'm not sure why exactly they are,
I think
but
a lot of it goes into dating and relationships because I think where they are, a lot of the stuff that is supposed to work, they have just seen it not working so hard that whatever
mm,
is working is so different that it's maybe more natural to them than it was for folks of prior generations who still hadn't been able to see this
oh,
stuff on full display yet.
yeah,
Um, I do like his last sentence from that paragraph you were reading. It says, omission of the gendered framing shifts the emphasis toward extending a universal politeness, honesty, and kindness toward all peoples, reviving the older sense of chivalry from which romantic chivalry originally diverged to become the dominant or bastardized meaning. And the next sentence in the next paragraph I thought is really good too. Such an amendment would free men and boys to discover a variety of non-gynocentric masculinities and revive the
mm,
notion of common courtesy as a basis for reciprocal service in devotion between men and women. So I really like that idea of reciprocal sort of common courtesy from men and women, maybe to each other or just to other people in there, instead of
yeah.
just a one-way direction on this road here.
Well, that seems to be coming out even like um, it seems like it comes up a lot with that Andrew Wilson guy,
Hmm.
where he asks a lot of times, like, okay,
What
you've
do
given
men
me all
get?
the duties that men have.
Yeah.
What are the duties that women have? And everybody is just like deer in the headlights.
Well,
Like nobody has a clue what he's talking about when he says, "What duties do women have?"
I've had this question, a similar one. I'll talk about it with John from It's Complicated. We kind of have like we'll make fun of it because it's like, on the one hand, okay, men are expected to open doors, put the jacket over the puddle, whatever it is, all this stuff. But then it's like when you get back home, it's just like, okay, so I finished my cup of tea. Like, you're just gonna pick up the cup of tea and take it over there and wash it for me. It's like if outside the house men are doing all this, then inside the house women would be
Oh,
ostensibly serving men. It's like, oh, if this is a gentleman, what are the ladies' duties? But we don't often hear about the ladies' duties. Instead, it'll be like, well, feel free to serve yourself or something, some kind of
yeah,
remark
no,
like that.
I think it's really good. It seems like there might be a watershed moment happening where society and men in general just like, nah, we're not signing up for this anymore of just like a
Yeah,
one-way street where
make it
there's
worth our
no duties
time.
on one end and all the duties on the other end. Like, nah.
That's where I love the dowry conversation because it, I know we can't go back in time or something, but it's just funny because it just gives such a nice staging ground to say, okay, what's coming from your side of the equation here? And
Yeah.
they can't say it's non-traditional or that you shouldn't be asking because it doesn't make sense because it's like, well, no, this is very much well rooted in history, especially
Yeah.
European history. So I like this
Mm-hmm.
idea of reciprocity that Peter adds in here uh,
Mm-hmm.
in that last paragraph. That part really spoke to me.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. Mm. Well, any final thoughts on the chapter then?
No, I think we brought that one. I think we did a pretty well-rounded job on that.
Mm.
So next time we'll be on chapter 3, whatever happened to chivalry. We'll see what's going on there.
Is that I've read it and I forgot. I'll read it again, but was that more of all the women complain that chivalry's dead type of thing, or
I'll have to reread it myself too. I did read it, but for these talks, I've been rereading them again just to make
me
sure.
too?
So
Yeah.
I think it's about like if it's really alive and well or not. And you always hear chivalry is dead. But then on the other hand, it's like when you look at it, like, is it really?
No, it is alive
It
and well
it is
there.
alive and well, and there's a lot of things that society does to ensure the welfare of women, but not so
Well, and even
much men.
like you really helped me rethink some things about like even with the red pill guys. I mean, it's still in a way chivalric or it's gynocentric that like,
Hmm.
well, I'm going to make myself the best I can be so that I qualify for a good woman and I can get one or maybe multiple women or whatever.
I
Uh,
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I would say it kind of goes more into that overpayment because they'll recognize a lot of these things, but they'll
mm,
still essentially say, okay, well, here's the standard. And on the one hand, they'll say, women's standards are delusional. On the other hand, it's, well, this is what you got to do to meet those same delusional standards. So there's a huge
yeah, yeah.
overpayment still going on. And this is where a lot of the MGTOW guys will say, okay, yeah, I can do that, I guess, but at the same time the deal is so bad I'd rather just walk away. So it's an
Yeah.
interesting thing there. So it's like, okay, do I overpay, or you know what I mean? So that's kind of the funny
Yeah.
part of the sort of pickup artistry side of the red pillars there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point that the red pillars and then like you were saying the trad cons are the same. Like, well, you must keep your woman in the life of leisure. And I think Rollo's even been talking about this more now. I don't know, maybe he's been listening to your stuff or something, but he seems like the past couple of months he's been talking about that more like, yes, you must keep your woman in the life of leisure or else you're not a real man. Blah blah
Gosh.
blah.
Yeah, that's just ridiculous. It's just unsustainable for me. Like, yeah, sure, some people will be able to do that, but it's not sustainable for most of
Yeah.
society here. So that's where I tend to focus on. It's like, okay, yeah, you can do that. That can
Mm,
work if your goal is to, I guess, just sleep around or whatever. But if you're going to be in a
mm.
situation where you're living under harsh family law and you got to leverage yourself with, kids and having property together and sharing finances and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's like, okay, what's really going to work here? What isn't? That's the
Yeah.
challenge, basically. The long-term sort of play. What is that?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. Mm.
I remember,
Well, it's been. Or go ahead, Shaw.
well, I was just gonna say, I remember there was I did a video on this. I think it was Officer Tatum, and he was on the Whatever podcast. And he was kind of lecturing and saying, well, she should stay home. She shouldn't have to work. And you don't like, he's basically saying, okay, she doesn't have to work. There shouldn't be that two income of mom and dad working. And then like a few sentences later, he's just like, you got to do whatever you got to do. If you got to take a second job, then that's what you got to do. It's like, well, there's your two incomes again in order to sustain this. It was just kind of funny to me. So
Yeah, because if you don't, and you just tell her to, hey, you got to we're going to live hand to mouth because I'm not working two jobs. Well, then you're getting divorced. So you either work two jobs. So
you got to be the guy in the book who's covered in blood from chopping up so much meat while she wears gold chains and rings. Otherwise, it goes back into this thing of overpaying. You know what I mean? It's just, again, overpaying. And it's a weird word, but it's just kind of trying to like make a long shot happen. And everybody needs to somehow get this, Hail Mary in order to make this work. And not everybody's going to be able to do that, unfortunately. So here we are.
And I do kind of feel a little bit like Rollo because hopefully I'm conscious about not grandstanding that I've got a great wife and I have a great family and I've got 5 kids and my wife is very committed to me. And the temptation is, especially in the Christian world, is like, wow, see, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, if I can do it, then there's no reason.
Yeah, and I was like, boy, the averages don't look so good, though.
Yeah, that's the issue. I mean, the issue with that advice is that it's been given so much, and people have taken it for a long time, but it just keeps not working for a lot of people, unfortunately. So, I mean, I tend to be optimistic about a lot of the stuff. I do believe there's a path forward and there's a creative way out of this and stuff that people can do. I tend to want to see things that way, but kind of beating on a dead horse and saying the same thing over and over again and just swinging the club and hitting the people's heads over and over it doesn't seem to exactly be working.
It's not. Yeah, if we have the lowest number of marriages on record in 2024, then it's not working.
Yeah, fertility rates in the tube.
Yeah, and nobody's having kids, and so whatever we're doing isn't working. So although Donald Trump says he is the fertility president, he wants to be remembered as the.
I am very interested to see what he decides to do. The only thing I've heard from him on that, I haven't kept up with it recently, but they were talking about, I think, doing some kind of program to make IVF more affordable for women.
That was one thing.
But I don't know if there was any other plans for getting families together, whether husband and wife.
And that's what I know. Paul Elam was talking about it just in, I think, his most recent show. And one of the things was they were going to basically pay single mothers more money. And he was like, how much more money do we need to pay single mothers? Like, this is what led to the problem. Like, what are you doing?
Well, it's interesting because it's gynocentric. Now, in some of those newspaper clippings, that Peter Wright's the one who found these newspaper clippings, but a couple of them actually talk about these dowry programs that the state would do, where they would essentially offer dowries for women so they can apply for them. And if they were, someone of upstanding character, and then who they wanted to marry was somebody that had a trade or looked like they were going to have some kind of income going forward, the state would provide some kind of dowry. And I can almost see there being a version of that, maybe in our modern world. I've heard something suggested around the space. There was a guy, Legion of Men, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but he was talking about interesting programs where it's like maybe you can have specialized home loans where if the people are married, if they have one kid, then 40 grand gets knocked off that loan that they owe, and maybe if they have 2 kids or 3 kids, there's some other benefits there, so they can have these goals that they work together. Maybe they can get into a house a little bit easier with some type of government program. It would be reminiscent. It would be like a pseudo dowry program from the government, which we have historical precedents for. And some of these were helpful in getting families together to, encourage family formation. So if the state's going to be in our lives, I know people don't like the idea of the state being more in our life. I get it. But if they're going to be in our lives and do everything else and take over everything, then maybe it has a responsibility to have some kind of pseudo dowry program that encourages people to take the deal and get married, and you
Well,
know.
I was just listening to some pronatalists today.
Hmm.
Uh, the Malcolm Collins and his wife, I forgot her name, but anyway,
I think I might have seen them before once or twice.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're kind of strange,
Uh-huh.
but uh, they're saying in the Middle East, I forget, I don't know if it was the UAE or whatever, but they will pay for your wedding
That's
if you want to
interesting.
have, or I think it was like they'll give you the equivalent of like
That
$20,000
sounds
towards
like a
your
dowry
wedding.
program right there. You know, it's like
Yeah,
Russia does something like that, like something similar too, right? Where,
but I think this was for actually the ceremony, and they
yeah.
said if you wanted to, something about like you could use the palette, like they would do group weddings
Uh-huh.
where you could use the palace
Uh-huh.
and to have your wedding in. Now you wouldn't be the only one having the
Yeah.
wedding, but you'd have a wedding in the palace. I guess they're opening it because they so badly want people to get married.
I that the wedding part seems interesting, but to me it's like I hope it's more than just the wedding. I hope it's something to actually set up the household for the folks, you know. Um
Yeah, that's
that
I
would
don't
be
know.
that, because you know dowries really were to help create this conjugal fund and to help set up a household too. And
When I think they said part of it was, or sorry, go ahead.
well, no, I was just gonna say, so it's like I think if there was a program like that that maybe encouraged folks to kind of do that and maybe stay together, because if it's just cheaper IVF for women, then it's like, yeah, you can just be creating more single moms. But it's if you're doing an actual program
Yeah.
that's encouraging people to keep their family together and stay together, then it might help. I don't know, but I mean, you know, I don't know what'll work, but it's like we got to get creative and think of something that's outside
You,
of the box here.
I just wonder with that though, like if they started to keep families together, if they were like, well, see, you're going to get a tax incentive if you're married to, I don't know, like whatever percentage off your taxes. I would just think like that probably if almost 80% of divorces are initiated by women, I doubt that would persuade them like, well, yeah, but we're going to lose that tax benefit, blah,
Yeah,
blah.
you're
Just be
right.
like, I don't care. You're going to pay no matter what tax benefit
Yeah.
you're not like you're paying. So
Yeah.
you think it'd have to be something that would almost be one-sided punitive towards women in the way that marriage seems to be going
I,
right now.
yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it can't be something that's so heavily biased towards one side. I mean, both sides would have to have some sort of skin in the game or some sort of consequence from walking away. And if it's only one side has to pay and one side has the consequence, it's just not going to work. The other side's going to wait for the best time to pull the ripcord and get the benefits of
Yeah.
that. So, yeah, that's an interesting conversation. I think we're headed towards something where, you know, I want to be positive and say I hope whatever Trump's platform or plan happens to be with that it's something that's effective and, you know, encourages families
Well,
to do that. I hope it's family centric and not just for, you know, the ladies, basically.
well, yeah, I mean, you would think with what he's been through in divorce courts and even Elon Musk,
Yeah.
he's always sincere. What Elon Musk has been through in divorce courts and that kind of stuff. I mean, you would think they would be both be pretty well versed in like, yeah, this is what happens to men,
You would think
and
so. You would think so. It is kind of weird because I don't know what it is. Sometimes it seems like some men will have that happen to them and they're still deep in the conditioning or something, or they're just like, oh, it was just one bad one. But Elon Musk at this point, and same thing with, you know, the president, I'm sure they better have noticed some patterns at this point. I think they've all been married more than once or been
well,
at this point,
well, yeah,
like,
I think Elon's
uh,
only once, and it seemed like he learned his lesson. Like, hey, why do I need to get married now? I can have children with these
God,
women.
okay, so he was only married to one of them, and then after like that,
Yeah, as far as I know,
yeah.
I think he had 5 kids with his first wife,
Okay.
and then she divorced him.
Oh.
And after that, he's just had children with random
If the
women.
world's richest guy can't if he can't be immune to divorce, then you know the sort of advice to
Oh,
get rich and do all this isn't gonna. That's no guarantee for anybody.
Well, I'd say if Tom Brady can't keep his
Yeah,
wife,
exactly. If he can't,
then who can
who
keep their wife? Like, man, you got an awesome football star, rich, whatever. Like, he can't keep his wife.
that
Like,
should tell you something that we need to rethink what we're doing here, because whatever we call marriage, at least with the state, is nothing like what it probably used to be or was intended to be or
yeah.
operate how it was. So
Well, this is Shaw coming on the channel to talk about chapter 2 of the book Chivalry. Well, that was good stuff. I hope you guys are liking this content. Give me a like if you like it. If you don't like it, well, give me a like anyway. All right. Well, it's good stuff. We got to get this turned around, especially in society. We got to get it turned around. And luckily, we are getting it turned around because Christ is winning. He is building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Until next time, this is the Post Millennial Man.